When thinking about child prodigies, Ted Kaczynski, more commonly known as the Unabomber, probably doesn't spring to mind. Yet consider Dabrowski's theories, namely that working through the disintegration of one's ideals, experiences, and expectations leads to understanding. If, for gifted individuals with extreme overexcitabilities, their existential disillusionment can't be reintegrated with acceptance, they may find themselves stuck in disintegration, a serious situation that could lead to psychosis. This is Ted's story. In 1942, Ted Kaczynski and Wanda Dombeck, two second-generation working-class Polish Americans, had saved enough money to get married. Their first child, Theodore John Kaczynski, who they later called Ted, was born quickly thereafter. When Ted was 7, his brother David was born. And just like that, he went from being an only child to becoming a big brother. Having already taught himself to read, Ted started nursery school at age 3, but he didn't like to play with other children. His preschool teacher reported, "Ted has very strong ideas as to what he wants to do and how he wants to do it." For 1st through 5th grades, he attended Sherman Elementary School in Chicago, where he was a precocious thinker and a talented mathematician. A family friend described Ted as a genius in a kid's body. Despite this talent for learning, Ted was not comfortable with unexpected people or events. His brother David recalled, "When we were young, friends and family would turn up at our house unannounced, and my feeling was like, 'Oh good, here's Uncle Stanley or our friend Ralph.' But Ted's reaction was the opposite. He saw it as an intrusion into his world." Every weekend, their father would drive the boys out into the woods around Chicago. They would camp, make bonfires, and take long nature hikes. David claimed that Ted was the happiest during these explorations, saying, "I got the feeling it was an escape from the cultural and social stresses he just didn't really want to deal with." When Ted was 10, he and the family moved to Evergreen Park, a suburb outside of Chicago. Ted's parents later told him that their new home was in an area that had a higher class of people, and so he and his brother would be attending a better school and making better friends. Before he started at Evergreen Park Junior High, the school psychologist administered the Stanford Binet test. Ted scored what was termed a genius-level IQ of 170. He also took a personality test that indicated he was highly social and quite well-adjusted. In light of later events, it's now believed that Ted was so smart he just figured out the most appropriate answer for each question and outwitted the test. Evergreen Park Junior High followed a very traditional school structure, so a talented student like Ted's only option was to simply skip 6th grade and accelerate directly into 7th. He was almost 2 years younger and significantly smaller than his classmates, yet academically he was at the very top of the class. He continued, however, to feel that he was very different, and that worsened his social difficulties. Nonetheless, Ted's talents in math and science became even more pronounced. Here he is in math club. During Ted's school years, students routinely participated in duck and cover drills just to be ready in the event of a nuclear attack. This institutionalized fear of technological destruction deeply influenced Ted's perceptions of the world. Racial tensions caused by desegregation were also part of Ted's school years. Wanda and Ted Kaczynski remained outspokenly liberal, so the family was taunted and had rocks thrown through the windows of their house. For Ted, already struggling with socialization, this would have been especially difficult. Ted usually retreated to a private space in the attic. He was a voracious reader and a passionate writer about eclectic topics like ancient Greek tragedies. He played the trombone and the recorder, teaching himself music theory and listening to the works of Bach and Vivaldi. His mother wrote, "Much of his time was spent contriving numerous gadgets made up of wood, string, wire, tapes, lenses, gears, wheels, etc. His table and desk was always a mess of test tubes, chemicals, batteries, ground coal." Once, because his little brother David was too short to reach the doorknob, Ted invented a clever door-opening contraption out of string and a spool of thread. When Ted was a freshman in high school, he began to have trouble with his math teacher because he pointed out and corrected mistakes that she made in class. So despite his youth, his small size, and his social awkwardness, the school decided it was best to just fast-track Ted right towards graduation. Graduating with high honors at 15, Ted was ready for the next phase of his life. And at 16, he was off to Harvard University, originally intending to study physics, but soon switching to math. Harvard had recently added a new general education curriculum meant to blend integrated humanities classes with positive courses grounded in the value-free research that was applied by its scholars to one specialized academic field. A classmate of Ted's claimed that the new Gen Ed actually created a climate of angst. From the humanists, we learned that science threatens civilization. From the scientists, we learned that science cannot be stopped. Taken together, they implied that there was no hope. For a student like Ted, one of the brightest, most conscientious, yet least mature, this dichotomy had a distressing effect. Now, meet the Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. During World War II, Murray had served with the OSS, a forerunner to the CIA, working on military interrogation techniques. Murray continued his research at Harvard in his study Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men. In this experiment, subjects were first asked to compose a deep personal philosophy of life, and during subsequent interviews, each was attached to electrodes, seated under hot, bright lights, and interrogated about his ideals. Henry Murray himself called these interviews, quote, vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks. As a sophomore, 17-year-old Ted Kaczynski was recruited as a research subject for this study and spent the next 3 years participating in weekly interrogations. Following graduation from Harvard in 1962, Ted went to the University of Michigan for his master's degree in mathematics. His research project, Boundary Foundations, won the prize for the best thesis, and Ted continued at Michigan to complete his PhD. In 1967, Ted got a tenure-track position in the math department at Berkeley, becoming the youngest assistant professor in the history of the university. Despite Berkeley being a center of political and social protest, family and friends say Ted was hyper-focused on math. His brother recalled, "It's like he can put a limit around something, and within that world he would become totally absorbed." Unfortunately, Ted's approach to math was a theoretical one, not tacit, so he was a terrible teacher. He lectured straight from a textbook and refused to answer students' questions. So in 1969, Ted resigned suddenly, with absolutely no explanation beyond he was tired of teaching engineers math that was going to be used for destroying the environment. By 1971, Ted Kaczynski had become a Luddite survivalist, living alone in a remote Montana cabin without electricity or running water, and increasingly convinced of the principles he presented in his manifesto, namely that technology and industry were taking over society and subsuming human freedoms. This tract quite literally makes manifest Ted's struggles with existential depression and personality disintegration. And 2 years later, he began a terrorist campaign that would eventually land him on both the Postmaster General's and the FBI's most wanted list as the Unabomber. Theodore Kaczynski, child prodigy and Unabomber, was convicted in 1979 on 10 counts of illegally transporting, mailing, and using bombs, and 3 counts of murder. Today, he is serving 8 life sentences as a supermax prison in Colorado. Despite his personality disintegration, by all accounts, he remains very well read, continues to be well spoken, and would appear to be well adjusted. Ted's story aligns with what research suggests are positive and negative potentials of profound talent. Extremely gifted individuals like Ted possess Dabrowski's overexcitabilities: intellectual, emotional, imaginational, psychomotor, and sensual, and experience reality in more intense and multifaceted ways. They may also struggle with an existential depression that makes the process of personality disintegration and reintegration difficult. It's tempting to think that had Ted's education occurred in a 21st century school, he would have fared better. But considering the extent to which new school continues to reflect constructs of 20th century old school, the outcome may just as likely have been the same. In fact, despite all the educational redesign efforts of the past 50 years, there is a growing number of disengaged individuals, those who fall into existential depression, disintegrate, and in their inability to reintegrate, retaliate against the social structures they feel have betrayed them. Perhaps To impact Ted and others like him, increasing emphasis should be placed on social context rather than content, enrichment rather than acceleration, flexible grouping over age stage, and integrated processes over products. Obviously, outcomes of prodigy are not always as bleak as Ted's, but they can be. Perhaps, like individual perspectives and personalities, our educational paradigms also need to go through a process of disintegration and reintegration so as to attain a higher level of efficacy and integrity. Here are 2 quotes related to Ted Kaczynski's unhappy prodigy story. Consider them. Reflect about them. How should ideas about multipotentiality, overexcitability, existential depression, personality disintegration, and reintegration factor into our work as teachers of the gifted?